Greetings and welcome to yet another Mr. Rogues video. In this video I'm gonna count down the top 10 greatest stories featuring Jonathan Crane, aka the Scarecrow, the Master of Fear. Yes, it's another remake of one of my old videos, the top 5 best Scarecrow stories. One of my very first videos. I figured it was about time I finally covered Scarecrow as well. I've been meaning to for a long time now, but for some reason I just haven't gotten to it. But now here we are. And of course, as always with these types of videos, do keep in mind that these are my personal opinions only and not a definitive list. Feel free to write down your favorite Scarecrow stories down in the comments. And let's just get right into it. Number 10. Nightfall. Yeah, the big 90s arc where Bane broke Batman's back. And what did he do before breaking his back? Well, he let loose all the inmates of Arkham Asylum, of course including the Scarecrow. Now what did Scarecrow do during this arc? Well, he did something sorta unusual. He teamed up with the Joker. And together this unholy pair caused a whole lot of chaos in Gotham. They kidnapped the mayor and forced him with fear toxin to do all kinds of crazy things. Crane and Joker truly made for a fun duo, and I gotta say that their parts of Nightfall are probably my favorite parts of the entire arc. For some reason, the Scarecrow and the Joker just fit really well together as a duo. I don't really know why. I mean, in a lot of ways they're opposites, but in a lot of ways they're also very similar. They're probably the two most sadistic villains in the Batman Rogues Gallery, at least among the big villains. They get a kick out of torturing people, so they certainly have that in common. And there's just something about fear and comedy. I guess there's such a great contrast to each other that they end up working really well together. And number 9 is The Man Who Radiated Fear from Batman number 200, published in 1968. The story was written by Mike Friedrich and penciled by Cheek Stone. Yeah, the special 200th issue of Batman, and the comic does indeed celebrate that. It celebrates it with a big Scarecrow story. This was actually the 4th Scarecrow story ever made, so it's very early in the character's history. This was the first time actually that the Scarecrow was truly spooky. It was also before the character got his now famous fear toxin, but he does use a fear potion in the comic. It's a pill that he swallows himself. This then makes anybody instantaneously terrified of him. This does indeed include Batman and Robin. They become so terrified, in fact, that they flee back to Wayne Manor and just hide out in the Batcave, shivering out of fear. Too scared to do anything. Yeah, they seriously consider giving up their crime-fighting crusade. That's how bad Scarecrow got them. You can tell they really wanted to make this issue special, being the 200th issue, and it really is, because I don't think we had ever at the time seen Batman and Robin so broken. I mean, they basically give up on their crime fighting. I mean, only for a little while, of course, but still. Certainly a very impressive feat from the Scarecrow, so I definitely think it deserves a spot on this list, and it's a fun read too. Number 8 is The Sinister Straws of the Scarecrow from Batman 296, published in 1978. This story was written by David V. Reed and penciled by Sal Amendola. So the Scarecrow has a kinda convoluted scheme going on in this story. He's basically scaring criminals into returning loot from old crimes to the police, but along the way, Scarecrow intercepts them and steals the loot himself. Yeah, like I said, it's a bit convoluted and unnecessarily complicated. But his scheme is not why this comic is so great, it's the portrayal of the Scarecrow that's so great, the depiction of him, both in writing and in art. I really love the artwork for this comic. It looks like no other comic of the time, really. Very creepy artwork, like from some horror comic. And Crane is depicted as a very sadistic bastard, which is of course exactly what he should be. He's very scary and creepy in this comic. Surprisingly, a lot of comics fail in portraying him like this. This issue also happens to feature the very first appearance of the fear toxin. Yeah, the patented, iconic fear toxin. The gas that makes you hallucinate your worst fears. That appears here in this comic for the very first time. It's used very well too. Number 7, Cycle of Violence, from Batman the Dark Knight issues 10 to 15, published in 2012. This 6-part New 52 story was written by Greg Hurwitz and penciled by David Finch. It's basically a retelling of the Scarecrow's origin story for the New 52 continuity. The Scarecrow has had several origin stories across the decades, but out of all of them, this is my personal favorite. I think it does the best job at explaining why Jonathan Crane would become as sadistic and crazy and evil as he is. In the most believable way. I don't think the other ones quite succeed at it. So the story reveals that Crane grew up with a very insane father who used him in various sick fear experiments. That's right, his father experimented with fear as well. He was hired by the government to create a fear toxin that was supposed to be used as a military weapon. And he used his young son as the guinea pig. Flash forwards to the present, and Crane is now the Scarecrow, and he's doing exactly the same thing as his father did. He's kidnapping children and subjecting them to fear experiments. This time around, he's trying to create a new, improved fear toxin that he's then gonna unleash on the entire city. The reason both he and his father chose to use children for these experiments is because children are easier to scare and thus you get better results. Or so they reasoned. But yeah, it's just so horrifically ironic that Crane is doing exactly the same things to other kids as his father did to him when he was a kid. It's a horrible cycle of violence. And our number 6 is The Frightener, from Batman Gotham Knights issue 49, published in 2004. This story is actually not the main feature of this comic, it's actually the backup, a black and white backup tale. It was written by Jeff Johns and penciled by Tommy Castillo. Even though it is just a black and white backup tale, it's still certainly worth your time. Even though it is a pretty short story, it's essentially a reimagining of the Scarecrow. It comes up with a completely new motivation for him. Basically, this story establishes that Jonathan Crane is addicted to fear. He loves feeling terror, and he wants other people to also feel this wonderful feeling. He wants to share it with everybody else. And this is the reason he invents the fear toxins and becomes the Scarecrow. He just wants to spread this wonderful feeling of horrible terror. However, due to his constant exposure to various fear toxins and hallucinogenics and chemicals and drugs, he's basically become numbed to feeling fear. He can't feel any fear at all any longer. He can't feel this wonderful feeling. And of course he finds that horrible. There is one thing that still makes him afraid. One single thing that scares the Scarecrow. And that is the Batman. Yes, the Batman still makes him feel afraid. So this also explains why the Scarecrow constantly goes out after the Batman. Because he needs that kick he gets from him. It's really a perfect explanation for their constant rivalry. I mean, a lot of stories kind of have problems with explaining Crane's motivations and why he's committing crimes in the first place. They kind of struggle with it. Sometimes they're pretty weak, like he's only after money, and other times it's incredibly petty. He just wants revenge on bullies from when he was a kid. But what we got in this obscure, forgotten little backup tale is actually a perfect explanation for why he would commit crime and continue to commit crime on and on and on and challenge the Batman. It's really odd we haven't seen these motivations for him in more stories. I mean, they have popped up in a couple of stories, but it's only very small things. But honestly, I wouldn't mind if it became the main depiction of the character, because it works so well, and because so many creators struggle with writing the character. And number 5 is Fear for Sale from Detective Comics 571, published in 1987. This old classic was written by Mike W. Barr and penciled by Alan Davis. And it is indeed a classic because it actually got an adaptation in the new Batman Adventures. Yes, this is a story where the Scarecrow invents a new drug that doesn't make you go afraid, but instead removes all your fears. It's the anti-fear toxin. And why does Crane do this? I mean, it sounds kinda counterintuitive. Well, as it turns out, having no fear at all is pretty damn dangerous. You become reckless, you do crazy things, you endanger your life constantly. So, Crane's scheme is to give this thing to people and then sell the antidote to them. However, he didn't take into consideration that these people, having no fear, don't really care about getting any antidote. They don't care about anything. So his plan completely fails. But the thing about this story is that the Scarecrow doesn't seem to care either that his plan failed. He's just kind of going along with it and having a good time. That's what I love so much about this story, besides the awesome art by Alan Davis. It's a truly deranged and kooky Scarecrow in this story. I mean, he's doing this scheme for profit, but at the same time, it doesn't really seem that that's the true reason he's doing it. He's just kind of doing it more as an experiment, I guess, to see how things go, to observe how people behave when they feel no fear. It more comes off as that. And of course, this is also the comic where he douses Batman with this compound. And so Batman loses all of his fear too and becomes completely reckless. And so there's a ton of great stuff there with that, the fearless Batman. And this is also the story where the Scarecrow kidnaps Jason Todd, the second Robin of course. And Batman has to save him, even though he's really not in control of himself any longer. Yeah, just an all-around amazing comic, and truly one of the most classic, maybe the most classic Scarecrow comics of all time. And our number 4 is Kings of Fear from Batman Kings of Fear, a 6-issue miniseries published in 2018. It was written by Scott Peterson and penciled by Kelly Jones. This is a pretty unusual comic because in this one, the Scarecrow douses Batman in a fear toxin not to hurt him, but to help him. That's right, if the drugged up Batman refuses to join Dr. Jonathan Crane for a therapy session, he'll kill a hostage he's holding. Yeah, this comic is Batman and the Scarecrow having a therapy session together. The Scarecrow wants to help Batman get over all of his doubts and fears. But of course, this being the Scarecrow, he does it in a pretty bizarre way. Out of all depictions of the Scarecrow from the comics and various other media, this one from this comic is probably the one that resembles my version of the Scarecrow from the Arkham Patient sessions the very most. Basically a disturbed psychiatrist who thinks he's helping people, and he kind of wants to help people, but in his own twisted way. So yeah, I mean, this depiction of Crane resembling my own so much, naturally I'm really gonna like this story. I mean, we really should get more of Scarecrow stuff like this, where he's the psychiatrist, and not just the mad chemist as he usually is. And of course, you gotta love that gorgeous art by Kelly Jones. Not many people draw the Scarecrow as well as Jones does. And number 3 is Concert of Fear from Batman Scarecrow 3D, published in 1998. That's right, a one-shot 3D comic. It was written by John Francis Moore and penciled by Carl Critchlow. So, a 3D comic? Really, Rogues? Are you that desperate? Well, no! This is actually a really good story. It's not just a cheap gimmick. I mean, the gimmick is pretty cheap. 3D comics, that's stupid. But the story is surprisingly good. Great, amazing in fact. I mean, I'm putting it at number 3. Don't shy away just because it's in 3D. Read this comic anyway. If you're a Scarecrow fan, you have to read it. So what's the plot about in this 3D comic? Well, in the story there's a new musical artist in Gotham called Bliss who's performing in various nightclubs. And it turns out that during his performances he releases a hallucinogenic drug on the audience. But it's a hallucinogenic drug that's the complete opposite of Crane's fear toxin. It makes you hallucinate nice things. Nevertheless, it's still illegal, I guess, so Batman is investigating this case. While doing so, he and Robin happens to stumble upon a Scarecrow scheme. Because Scarecrow is also after Bliss. Now, why is Scarecrow after Bliss? Well, he's planning to hijack one of Bliss's concerts. And instead of using Bliss's nice hallucinogenic gas, he's gonna spray the audience with fear toxin. Yeah, that's the Scarecrow's plan in this story. Now, why is he specifically gassing a bunch of teenagers at a concert? Well, because he's a bitter old man. That's why. He's a bitter old boomer. He doesn't like these young kids having fun and enjoying themselves. He wants them to suffer because he's always suffered. Even when he was young, he suffered then as well. Jonathan Crane has never had any fun ever in his entire life. So he wants to ruin all fun for everyone else as well. He's basically a Grinch. But you kinda understand him because he has suffered all his life. So while he is a mean old bastard, you still feel a bit sorry for him, but not too much. And I don't think you should feel too sorry for the Scarecrow, but a little bit is great. Yeah, this is a perfect depiction of the character. And we really need to see more writers portray him like this. He's freaky and creepy and pretty evil, but we still kinda understand him. And number 2 is No Man's Land, or specifically the Fear of Faith 4-part arc from the No Man's Land event. It was written by Devin Grayson and penciled by Dale Eaglesham. We all know what No Man's Land is, so I don't need to get into all of that, but what did the Scarecrow do during this massive arc? Well, he really didn't appear that much. He only appeared in this story, this 4-parter that took place very early in the No Man's Land. Now, what is this 4-parter about? Well, I'll tell ya. It's about a church run by Father Chris, who's taking in people from all over the city, and is keeping himself and his community outside of all the various gang wars and turfs and all that. He doesn't care about any of that. He just wants to help people. Anybody. Everybody. So he's taking in people from various territories in the city and people of various faiths. And everybody's basically getting along in this little community inside the church. And who's also a part of this community? Why, it's the Scarecrow! Father Chris has even taken in the Scarecrow. Due to the circumstances of the No Man's Land, Crane doesn't have his fear toxin, and so Father Chris mistakenly believes him to be harmless. You should never do that. Never think that the Scarecrow is harmless just because he doesn't have his fear toxin. Big mistake. Because the Scarecrow is indeed not harmless. The Scarecrow begins to manipulate people within this community, including Father Chris himself, and starts to turn people on each other and is slowly tearing this community apart, tearing it apart with fear, and not with any drugs. He's just using words. And that's how effective the character really should always be portrayed. He doesn't need the fear gas all the time. It's not a crutch. It's just a tool, one of his many tools. There have been other stories that also try to prove that Crane doesn't need his gas to be a big threat, but I think this one does it a lot better because it's more subtle. It's not so in your face, like for example Absolute Terror. That's an awful story that did the same concept horribly. This is the way to do it. You don't need to call attention to the fact that Crane isn't using his gas. You just have him do what he does. Just show him doing things without the gas. That's the way to do it. And of course the best part about this story is Crane's motivation. He's not really trying to prove anything by doing all of this, and he's certainly not trying to prove that he can be a big threat without the gas. No, that's not what it's about. The only reason he's doing any of this, tearing this community apart from within, is because he sees it as an experiment. He just wants to see what happens. That's it. It's just a fun little experiment for him. Something to write down in his notes. That's all it is. And that's truly terrifying. A guy who does all of these horrible things just for a fun little experiment. And finally, the greatest Scarecrow stories of them all, in my opinion, is Mistress of Fear from New Year's Evil Scarecrow, published in 1998. A special one-shot issue written by Peter Milligan and penciled by Duncan Fegredo. So what is this greatest Scarecrow story of them all about? Well, it's about Scarecrow terrorizing a young teenage girl. Sounds fun. This girl, named Becky Albright, was the only person brave enough to testify against Crane after one of his many fear attacks. Crane tried to scare her out of testifying, but she refused to comply. And this got him caught and sent back to Arkham Asylum, where all the other inmates bullied him because he was beaten, essentially, by a teenage girl. This naturally humiliated old Jonathan Crane, so after breaking out of Arkham, he sets out to get revenge on this girl. However, upon exposing her to her greatest fears, he realizes that her fears are very similar to his. Just like he once was, Becky is a bullied outcast in school and suffers from some form of body dysmorphia. So instead of hating this young girl, Crane begins to see a sort of kinship in her, develops a sort of bond with her, and he even tries to recruit her as his sidekick, the Mistress of Fear. Yes, tries. Despite a huge fan demand for some reason for Becky to become the Mistress of Fear, this has never happened. So why is this the greatest Scarecrow story of them all, in my opinion? Well, it's great for a very similar reason as to my number 3 on this list. It does portray Crane as creepy and sadistic, but also at the same time kinda sympathetic. We kinda understand him in this story. Again, not too much, but kinda. We can sorta see it from his point of view. And it's even more explicit in this story because the comic is told through his eyes. He's the protagonist of the comic, not Becky Albright or Batman. It's a through and through Scarecrow story. And it is really hard to do this with the Scarecrow, to see things through his eyes and to make him sorta sympathetic. A lot of other stories have tried, but they always usually fail. This one does not. But it doesn't go overboard. It's not a sappy sob story where we're just supposed to cry for poor Scarecrow. No, it's not that. The comic still acknowledges the fact that he's a pretty wicked bastard, and that's what's so great about it. It's definitely a must-read for any Scarecrow fan. If you haven't read it already, go now, find it somewhere, read it. You gotta if you're a Scarecrow fan. And so, there you have it. That's my collection of the 10 greatest Scarecrow stories ever told. Finding good Scarecrow comics is not really an easy task, so I really hope this video can help you if you're a Scarecrow fan or just interested in a Scarecrow and you want to read some of his stuff. I hope this has helped you. And of course, as always, remember, Arkham Asylum awaits you in the next video.